key was in my hand, but the lock no longer recognized it. I stood on the front porch of the house I had lived in for 31 years, the same house where my wife, Margaret, and I raised our son, where I built a small workshop in the garage, and where I planted a maple tree in the backyard the year my grandson was born. I tried the key again, slowly, the way people do when they think they may have made a mistake the first time. The deadbolt didn't move. 2. The handle refused to turn. I stepped back and looked at the house the way a stranger might, noticing the new welcome mat, the freshly painted shutters in a color I had never chosen, and a small camera mounted above the door frame that I had never installed. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I already knew who was calling, and I let it ring. My name is Gordon Whitfield. I am 67 years old. I spent 38 years working as a senior auditor for a mid-sized manufacturing company outside London, Ontario, and another 4 years as a private financial consultant after I retired. I understand numbers, documentation, and the ways people hide things in plain sight. I also understand how paper trails work because I spent most of my adult life following them. My son Trevor is 39. He has the kind of charm you often see in salespeople, not necessarily because they genuinely enjoy people, but because they understand that warmth is a useful tool. Trevor sells commercial real estate, and he is good at it. He has my father's blue eyes and his mother's easy smile. For a long time, I believed that meant he had inherited the best qualities of both of them. I was mistaken about that, and about several other things related to Trevor. Realizing those mistakes was one of the more painful experiences of my life. But I'm moving ahead too quickly. Margaret died 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't give you much time to prepare. From diagnosis to the end, we had 8 weeks. During those weeks, I watched the woman I had been married to for 40 years gradually become someone I barely recognized. Then she was gone, and the house became very quiet. I won't spend too much time describing that period because it still takes something from me to talk about it. And in truth, this story is not really about grief. It is about what grief can do to a person's judgment and what others sometimes choose to do when they notice that your judgment has been weakened. Trevor was attentive after Margaret passed away, and it is only fair to say that. He called every few days. He came over for dinner on Sundays. He helped me go through Margaret's belongings when I was finally ready to do that. His wife Diane was thoughtful and supportive, and their son, my grandson Owen, who was 6 at the time, kept me from disappearing completely into the silence. For about a year, I believed we were doing well. I thought we were one of those families that come together after a loss instead of drifting apart. Then Trevor began asking questions about the house. Not directly at first. Trevor rarely approaches a subject head on. Instead, he circles around it. He introduces it sideways, places it into conversation between other topics, lets it sit there while the discussion moves on, and later returns to it from a slightly closer angle. I had watched him use this technique with clients at dinner parties and always found it impressive. I found it much less impressive when I realized he was using it on me. It began with concern, which is often how these things start. "Dad, this place is a lot to maintain by yourself, don't you think?" he asked. I told him I managed just fine. "The yard alone," he continued, "and you're not getting any younger. And those stairs, what happens if you fall?" I told him that if I fell, I would call 911 like anyone else. "I just worry," he said. "Diane worries too. We were talking and thought it might make sense to start considering your options. There are some very nice retirement communities around here. You could be somewhere with people your own age, activities, and support if you ever need it." I told him I was 63 years old and did not require support. He smiled and said, "Of course not. I just want to make sure you're planning ahead." At the time, I thought that conversation had ended the matter. It had not. Over the following months, the topic returned in different ways. Sometimes it was presented as practical reasoning. The cost of maintenance, property taxes, and the fact that the house had increased significantly in value, meaning I was holding an asset that was not actively working for me. Other times it was framed around health, a story about a friend's father slipping on ice and spending 3 months in rehabilitation, or a forwarded article discussing aging in place versus community living. Once, after I had a routine knee procedure, Trevor arrived at the hospital with Diane and Owen. He sat across from me in the recovery room with what I can only describe as carefully measured sympathy and said that moments like this were reminders that we all needed to think seriously about the future. I remember watching my grandson play with a toy truck on the floor beside the chair and realizing that I was tired of thinking about the future in the way Trevor wanted me to. By that time, the house was worth roughly $1.5 million. Real estate in London had performed very well over the 31 years since we bought it, and the neighborhood had become desirable in a way it had not been when Margaret and I were young. I knew this because I still paid attention to numbers. I understood what I owned, what it was worth, and I knew I had no intention of selling it. What I had not fully realized yet was how far Trevor had already moved beyond simply asking. I discovered that in March, about 18 months after Margaret passed away. I was reviewing some paperwork, nothing unusual, just organizing my files, when I noticed that a document I had signed the previous autumn looked different from what I remembered. It was a financial management authorization Trevor had brought over one evening, describing it as routine paperwork his accountant recommended for estate planning. He had explained it briefly at the kitchen table, answered a couple of questions, and I had signed it. I trusted him. He was my son. But reviewing it again carefully, the way I examined documents professionally rather than the casual way I had looked at it that evening, I realized the scope of what I had signed was much broader than he had described. It was not a complete power of attorney, not yet, but it was clearly a step toward that. Certain clauses hidden in language I had not examined closely enough granted him authority over decisions I had never intended to give him. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after realizing that. The feeling in that moment is difficult to explain. When you understand that someone you care about has been quietly working around you, the first reaction is not anger. It is something quieter and colder. You begin reevaluating every conversation from the past year, each gesture of concern, every Sunday dinner, every phone call, and you run them through a different filter. On the other side, they appear different. What remains is the quiet recognition that the relationship you believed existed may not have been exactly what you thought. I did not call Trevor. Instead, I called my lawyer. Patricia Okafor has handled my legal affairs for 22 years. She is methodical, unsentimental, and extremely thorough, three qualities I value greatly. I drove to her office the next morning with the document and every other piece of paperwork that seemed relevant. I spread them across her desk and explained what I suspected. Patricia read everything carefully, asked several questions, and then leaned back in her chair with the thoughtful expression she uses when organizing her conclusions. "Gordon," she said, "before we move forward, I want you to understand something. What you have here is concerning, but it isn't yet definitive. If you confront him now, he will know you are watching. Documents can disappear, explanations change, and it becomes difficult to prove what you believe happened." I asked what she recommended. "I recommend we proceed as if you don't know anything," she replied. "And I suggest we spend the next several months making sure that when you do act, there is nothing left open to dispute." That is the kind of lawyer Patricia is. Over the next 4 months, we documented everything. Patricia helped me quietly revoke the authorization I had signed and replace it with a properly structured document that gave Trevor no authority beyond what any adult child might reasonably assist with. We handled this carefully, without announcements, and without any change that might signal to Trevor that the situation had shifted. I also installed a professional security system in the house, with cameras at every entrance and footage stored off-site. When Trevor noticed and asked about it, I told him it was because of a break-in 2 streets away. He nodded and said that was sensible. It was sensible, although not for the reason I had given. During that time, I paid close attention. Trevor continued his visits, his calls, and the same gradual approach to conversation. At one point, he mentioned almost casually that he had a colleague who specialized in private real estate transactions, discreet arrangements, as he described them, something he said was useful for families dealing with complicated circumstances. I noted that quietly. On another occasion, he asked whether I had updated my will since Margaret died. I told him I was working on it with Patricia, which was true, and seemed to satisfy him for the moment. What I did not yet know, and what I was slowly discovering, was that Trevor had already progressed much further than I had assumed. Patricia called me one Tuesday morning in June. She had been making some discreet inquiries through professional channels she preferred not to explain in detail, and she had discovered something important. Trevor had met with a real estate lawyer, not one of his usual commercial contacts, but a residential specialist. There was paperwork already in motion, not yet filed and not fully completed, but clearly underway. It appeared to involve the transfer of my property. The authorization I had signed the previous autumn, the one with broader scope than I realized, had been used to begin that process. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store where I had just purchased milk and eggs. I looked at the trees lining the street and took several steady breaths. Then I called Patricia back and asked, "How much time do we have?" "Weeks," she replied. "Possibly a few months if we are fortunate." "Then let's finish setting the trap." What Trevor did not know was important. He did not know that the authorization had already been revoked and replaced with a document that looked nearly identical, but contained none of the authority he believed it gave him. He also did not know that Patricia had been coordinating with a fraud specialist she trusted. He was unaware that I had quietly transferred the property into a trust structure, something Patricia and I completed 3 weeks earlier. This meant the title he believed he was working with was no longer the real one, and he did not know that the security cameras recording every entry and exit from my home were connected to a cloud system that stored 60 days of footage at all times. Trevor believed I was a 66-year-old widower who missed his wife and trusted his son. In some ways, he was correct. The trip to Halifax was Patricia's idea. She believed it would help if Trevor thought I was far away and distracted. A long flight, an old friend, and a week away from the house. My friend Douglas Carmichael, who had taught with Margaret at Western for many years and who knew the entire situation, agreed to host me. I flew to Halifax on a Sunday and mentioned the trip casually to Trevor during a phone call. I also told him I had left a spare key with the neighbor in case anything happened. I had not actually left a spare key with the neighbor, but Trevor did not know that. On Wednesday, Patricia called me while I was sitting at Douglas's kitchen table. "They moved today," she said. I had expected it and prepared for it, but knowing something will happen and hearing that it has happened are two different things. I sat quietly for a moment before responding. Trevor and a man Patricia identified as his associate, someone from the brokerage he had mentioned, had gone to the house. A locksmith had been called, and the locks had been changed. My locks on my house. They had also attempted to file a transfer document according to information Patricia obtained through the title office. The document was rejected because the title they were using was no longer valid. The trust transfer had already been completed and registered, something they had not discovered. Their paperwork referred to a property that legally no longer existed in the form they believed it did. They had changed the locks on a house they did not own and could not transfer. I finished my coffee, thanked Douglas, called a car to take me to the airport, and flew home Thursday morning. I often think about standing on that porch because it captures the entire moment. The new welcome mat, the shutters painted in the wrong color, the camera installed above my door, and my key failing to turn in a lock that had belonged to me for 31 years. My phone was buzzing in my pocket, Trevor calling, most likely to deliver some explanation he had already prepared. I let it ring. I stood there a little longer than necessary, simply recognizing the weight of everything that had happened and what was about to follow. 31 years in that house, 40 years of marriage, and 39 years of raising a son, all condensed into a Thursday morning in late June with a key that no longer worked and a phone that kept vibrating. Then I took out my phone and sent Patricia a message. 3 words: "File everything now." She had been waiting for that instruction. I walked around to the back of the house, where Trevor had not thought to change the lock, went inside, put the kettle on, and called my daughter-in-law. Diane answered on the second ring. She sounded surprised to hear from me and then quickly uneasy. I told her I was home. I explained that I was sitting in my kitchen and waiting for the kettle to boil so I could make tea. Then I calmly told her that Patricia had filed everything that morning and that Trevor should probably speak with a criminal lawyer before the end of the business day. There was a long pause. "Gordon," she said finally, her voice completely different now, "I want you to know that I told him not to." "I know," I replied. "I know you did. That will matter." I drank my tea and waited. Trevor arrived about 40 minutes later. He entered through the front door, using a key to the new lock, and found me sitting at the kitchen table with my hands around a mug and a folder of documents placed in front of me. He stopped when he saw me. He looked at the folder and then at my face. Whatever he had planned to say, he did not say it. I told him to sit down, and he did. I explained what I knew, not every detail, because Patricia had advised me carefully about what to reveal and what to hold back for legal proceedings, but enough to make the situation clear. I told him about the authorization, how it had been used, about the property title that had already been transferred into a trust, about the rejected filing, and about the camera footage stored on a server in Toronto. Trevor is his mother's son in some respects. When he realizes he is cornered, he becomes quiet. He does not argue loudly or attempt to dominate the conversation. He sat across from me in silence, and I noticed an expression cross his face that I had not seen in years. It might have been shame, or it might simply have been the recognition that he had miscalculated badly. "Dad," he began. "Don't," I said. He closed his mouth. "I don't know," I continued slowly, "what you needed the money for badly enough to do this. I don't know whether it was business debt, something else entirely, or whether you simply looked at this house and decided it should belong to you before its time. That part will be determined by the lawyers and the court. That's not my job." He began to respond again, and I raised my hand. "My job," I explained calmly, "was to protect what your mother and I built, and that is exactly what I did." The legal process lasted 14 months. I will not go through every step because parts of it are still difficult, and much of it is simply technical and slow. What matters is the outcome. The fraudulent use of the financial authorization resulted in formal charges. Trevor's associate, the person who arranged the locksmith and submitted the transfer documents, cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. He provided a detailed explanation of the plan and how it had been carried out. Trevor eventually pleaded guilty to 2 counts of fraud. The court issued a conditional sentence that included significant fines, community service, and a period of probation. He did not go to prison. I want to clarify that point because people often expect a story like this to end with someone going to jail, and I am not sure that was ever my objective. What I wanted was accountability. I wanted a permanent record showing clearly that the attempt had happened, that it had failed, and that it carried consequences. Diane filed for divorce 8 months after the charges were laid. She was granted primary custody of Owen. I see my grandson every second weekend and on holidays, and those days are among the most meaningful parts of my life now. Trevor and I have spoken only twice since the guilty plea. Both conversations were short. I do not know what our relationship will look like in the future, or whether there will be one at all. That is something I have learned to live with rather than rush to resolve. The house remains mine. The maple tree in the backyard is taller than it has ever been. I had the locks changed back, my locks and my key again. The locksmith who did the work was a young man from Kitchener who commented on the quality of the original hardware and seemed genuinely pleased that he was restoring something rather than replacing it. I gave him a generous tip. Since then, I have spent some time thinking about what advice I would give to someone who finds themselves in a situation like mine. Someone who begins to suspect that a person they care about may be working around them instead of with them. Someone who is unsure whether to trust what they observe or what they feel. My advice is simple. Trust what you see. Document everything. Move slowly and carefully rather than quickly and emotionally. Speed usually benefits the person who is already acting, while patience favors the person who is paying close attention. Do not allow grief to make you careless with what you have built. This is more difficult than it sounds. When you lose the person who built those things with you, The results of your shared life can begin to feel less like achievements and more like burdens. The yard to maintain, the stairs to climb, the rooms that feel too quiet. People who want something from you may take advantage of that feeling. They may describe your home as a problem and present themselves as the solution. They will call it concern. Some may even believe it themselves, at least partly. But a home is more than a financial asset. It represents continuity. It is the physical record of a life lived over time. The maple tree I planted when my grandson was born stands beside the garage where his height is marked on the wall at 1, 2, and 3 years old in Margaret's handwriting. That memory alone is worth more than any offer anyone could place on the table. Do not assume that age automatically makes you a target. Sometimes it does. There are people who look at someone in their 60s or 70s and assume they see a person whose judgment has softened, someone they can guide or manage. Most of the time, those assumptions are wrong, and when that mistake becomes clear, it can be costly for the person who made it. Another piece of advice is to have a good lawyer. Not because you expect trouble, but because if something unexpected happens, and eventually something always does, you will already have someone who understands your situation and can act immediately. Patricia knew my records. She knew my intentions. Because of that, when the situation developed, we did not lose weeks explaining details. We acted the same day. And finally, it is possible to love someone while still holding them accountable. Those two things are not opposites. I loved my son, and in a complicated way, I still do. It is the kind of love that exists when someone has shown you something about themselves that you cannot ignore. Loving him did not mean allowing his actions to go unanswered. It meant telling the truth about what happened clearly and fully, and then allowing the consequences to follow. That is not cruelty. It is respect for him, for myself, and for everything his mother and I spent our lives building. The maple tree in the backyard will be beautiful this autumn. I already know it will.